it's Hidde, and I'm excited to be at CodeLand this year to be presenting to you. And I'll be talking about why I think it is the markup that matters. I just wanted to let you know that I've got a blog, you can find it on hidde.blog, and I write about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, accessibility, web standards, all sorts of things. So yeah, have a look at that or follow me on Twitter at HTV. Now, I want to talk to you today about the quality of websites. Now, there's a lot of aspects to that, right? We want good websites to be secure, performant, and of course, accessibility as well. And accessibility will be the main subject of today's talk. Now, what do we mean by accessibility? We mean that we want the web to be accessible to people with permanent disabilities. They could be people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people who are blind, or have visual impairments, and there are many more permanent disabilities that can make it harder for people to use digital technologies. And accessibility is all about making sure that our websites are accessible to everyone, including people with permanent disabilities. Now, there's a nice ripple-on effect because if you make your website accessible, they'll likely also work better for people who have temporary disabilities, like maybe someone who's had a skiing accident and broke their arm and cannot use it for a couple of weeks or months. And of course, also people who are in certain situations, like people who are carrying a baby on one arm and just have one arm available. So accessibility is about making the web accessible to people with permanent disabilities, but there are also lots of other people who benefit too. Now, web accessibility is the responsibility of everyone on the team. It includes content designers, web developers, UI designers, CMS integrators, user researchers. Almost everyone on the team can do something about web accessibility. But specifically today, I will be talking about what web developers can do. And often the task of web developers in web accessibility is all about writing code to make sure a website works better with assistive technologies. And these are technologies that are used by people with disabilities. For instance, screen readers that will read out what happens on the screen to people who are blind. Or braille displays who can translate what happens on the screen in real time to braille so that people can access the content that way. Now, when you go to any website, let's say we go to codelandconf.com, there's going to be a request that's sent to the server, and it's going to respond with a website. But of course, behind the scenes, what actually happens is that you're sent a bit of markup. It's sent to your browser, and the browser turns it into a DOM tree. Now, what not everyone knows is that there is a second structure that's based on the DOM tree, which is called the accessibility tree. You can find it in all the browsers, and basically it represents all the accessibility information that the browser has in a tree form. So for instance, it might know that on your page there is a form that contains a slider that can go to a maximum of 24 and a minimum of 0. The current value is 7. It's called departure time, and you can increment and decrement it. That's a lot of information about that node. And even if you've never seen a slider control, you might imagine by now what sort of control that could be. In your web page, visually this might be represented by a slider that you've built, but if someone uses assistive technologies, they may be getting a completely different interface to that same slider. Maybe they're using a switch control or control this thing by voice. And for all of that to work, the accessibility tree needs to know what this stuff is and kind of what the metadata is. So roles answer the question, what kind of thing is this? Is it a button? Is it a link? Is it a checkbox perhaps? A name is all about how can we refer to this thing. So is it a button for submitting, or is it a button for reloading? And then there is states and properties, which is basically everything else you might want to know about a control. For instance, that it is expanded or collapsed, or that it is hidden or visible. If you want to write accessible code, you want to write code that points machines at what everything is. It points machines at what things are called, and also what state stuff is in. Now, as I mentioned before, people with disabilities may be using assistive technologies to access your website. And these technologies, they usually transform what's going on the screen into a form that the user can make sense of through platform APIs. So these are APIs that are built into Windows, in Mac, and Linux. Obviously, when you have a browser, it might know about all the controls that are in the browser, but it probably doesn't know about the website that you're loading in the browser. Whenever I've typed in codelandconf.com, it's going to get that website for me, and it might be all new to my system. Now this is where the accessibility tree comes in. The accessibility tree is the missing link between the DOM tree and the platform API. So it's going to tell the platform APIs everything that is very specific to your website. And as I said before, it is based on your markup. So there is a lot of influence that we have as developers over what's going on in the assistive technology and how people experience our website if they are using assistive technologies. Now, if you want to know what an accessibility tree looks like, or you want to inspect it in real time, you can do this in all of the modern browsers. Now, by now you might understand the name of this presentation. It is the markup that matters, because markup usually affects what the accessibility tree looks like, what things are called. It answers questions like, what is this page? Which is something you can answer by providing a title element in your source code. And this is something that might seem quite simple, but often people forget about it because maybe the title is somewhere in a boilerplate bit of code that you usually don't touch. I see this all the time in audits that I perform. So it is important that your title contains information that is specific about the page that the user is currently looking at. There's this video by Leonie Watson, a screen reader user and also accessibility expert, where she explains that the title is usually the first guarantee or confirmation that she's ended up on the page that she wanted to go to. Another question that you can answer in HTML in markup is what is on this page, and you can do this by specifying headings. Headings are elements like H1, H2, H3. These are really important because assistive technology users very often use a mechanism called navigate by heading. They might press a button, they can access a list of headings that exist on a page, and then they use that to access specific sections. So for instance, what you see here is a screenshot of Wikipedia, where I've opened the voiceover screen reader that comes with the Mac. It displays a list of the headings that are available. So if I listen to it, it's going to read out all the headings, and then it will allow me to skip to a specific one. And then there's form controls. Form controls are extremely important to get right for users of assistive technologies. When WebAIM, a non-profit in the US, was looking at the top 1 million websites, they found that 59% of form inputs were not properly labeled. So this is really important. You want to make sure that input fields, radio buttons, checkboxes, select, text areas, that all of them have labels so that they have a name when they show up in the accessibility tree. I'll show you an example, a field that's called first name, and if I've marked it off as a div and I've put an input element in there, the way it's going to show up in the accessibility tree is with a row of text blocks or entry, depending on the browser you use. So that's got a good role. And it will show up with a name of null or empty string. Because browsers will compute a so-called accessible name to figure out what this thing is called. And they're looking at lots of different things like a real labeled by and a real label and placeholder and title. The first thing they'll be looking at is the label element, which you can add to your markup. So you add a label element with a for attribute that points at the ID of the input. And if you do that, you will see that the contents of the label will become the accessible name for this input. Another way you can make a difference with markup is by specifying table semantics. Tables, they make tabular data easier to navigate for users of assistive technology. It's important then to use table semantics, and that includes captions, which you can use to name the table. So for instance, if you have a table for net results of 2018, you can distinguish it from the one about 2019 by providing a caption, a unique name for that table. For every table row, you want to use a tr element. For headings inside of your table, you use a th element, and then inside the th element, you'll want to use a scope element, and you can distinguish whether it is about the column or the row. Something else you can make a huge difference in is if your buttons are just icons. When they are just icons, you want to make sure that they are still accessible names, and that is not always the case. So here I've got some example markup for icons. Maybe I've got a div with inside of that some SVG. Now if you look at the accessibility tree for that, it will tell you it's got a row of empty string and a name of empty string as well. Let's see if we can improve the accessibility tree a little bit there. First we want to make sure that the role is button, and we can do that by using the button element. It's as simple as that. If you use the button element, you get the role of button for free. Now this still doesn't have a name, so one thing we can do is add some text content to the button, which we might visually hide, and at that point the contents of our text will just show up as the name. So in this case it will resolve to add reaction, because I've added the words add reaction into a span that are then visually hidden. Now in some cases you might not have any meaningful markup for your component, and in that case ARIA can help you polyfill. Because with ARIA you can provide different names, roles, properties, and states through attributes. Now one thing to keep in mind though is that not all of ARIA has good support or provides good usability for users of assistive technologies. But an example of elements that do are expendables. So let's say you've got a tooltip. You might have a button that opens the tooltip. What you can do there is add ARIA to establish a relationship between the button and the thing that it opens. And you can do that by using ARIA controls. So in the ARIA controls attribute, you add the ID of the element that it is controlling. Then with the ARIA expanded attribute, you can say whether it is expanded or not. And that is all information that assistive technology can then expose to the end user. Now let's look a bit at what the future might look like. Accessibility Object Model, or AOM, is meant to make it easier to provide information to assistive technologies or find out what the browser is actually passing on. So it doesn't really add any new semantics or new states on top of ARIA. It uses ARIA, but it introduces new ways to specify the stuff that we already know from ARIA. And that allows you to no longer have to do any sprouting. So if you define a web component, for instance, and that web component needs to have a certain role or a certain ARIA attribute, one of the ways that you can do that currently is to add it onto the element. But that means that someone who's using this component also needs to copy-paste those attributes and properly set them. With AOM, you would be able to set ARIA through IDL attributes instead of markup, which means that in JavaScript you will be able to set the role or the ARIA disabled state. So you no longer need to set attributes, you can just interact with these values directly. Something else that AOM aims to solve is to set relationships without needing ID refs. And again, this is a use case that web components have, because in web components it's tricky to have relationships between stuff that's in the light DOM and stuff that is in the shadow DOM. So with AOM you would be able to set these relationships through JavaScript. Now there's a lot of different relationships that you might be wanting to set for accessibility. For instance, ARIA controls is one of the ones that we discussed earlier, that you can use for something that you are expanding. And like that, there's a number of different ARIA attributes that set a relationship between one element and another. And with AOM, you might be able to do this through JavaScript directly, without needing any attributes on top of that. Something else that AOM looks at is to be able to pass events from assistive technologies. Now there are a lot of privacy concerns around this, because we don't want to give developers the ability to find out if someone is using assistive tech. That would expose way too much data about the user that they might rather keep private. Now another idea in the AOM project is the ability to set non-DOM nodes in the accessibility tree. Now there are some privacy concerns about this effort, so this work might not actually happen. And then the last thing that AOM wants to address is to give you the ability to read the accessibility tree through JavaScript. Now the main use case for this, it would allow you to do a lot better testing, because rather than checking the values of attributes that are meant to provide information to the accessibility tree, you're looking at the accessibility tree directly and what it has computed stuff as. So rather than looking at maybe what's the value for a real label, you're looking at what the actual accessible name is and what it was computed to. Now that's a lot more valuable because it's a lot closer to what the user will be experiencing. So your tests are more accurate if you test that. Alright, so that's all for me today. I wanted to quickly recap my main takeaways for today. The first one is our apps need to be accessible. It's just one of the many things we need to do to make sure our websites have high quality. Just like security and privacy and good design, we've got to make sure our web apps are accessible. The other takeaway is that good markup really makes a difference because it gives us a lot of accessibility for free. If you're using a button element instead of a div, if you're creating buttons, it's going to save you a lot of time and give you a lot of accessibility for free. And the last one is names, roles, and states are all things that you can look up in the accessibility tree and figure out what things compute to. Alright, that was all for me. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks.